one of the ones that I always like to talk about when people say like, are we going to do 4-week cycles or 6? Why not 2? And like, agile is smaller cycles. And I said, to me, well, why are cycle times small? And so we start talking about this whole concept of the bets that you're taking, right? So it used to be in the waterfall world, you would take a huge bet. It was a 6-month, a 1-year risk, right? And we talked about it a little earlier, right? Where, in the software world, right? Redoing something is somewhat cheap, much cheaper than the manufacturing world. And so you want to take smaller bets, right? And so, and that was what Agile was about. You take smaller bets and you iterate over these bets. But I think in a lot of industry, just because something is good, more of it doesn't mean it's constantly getting linearly better, right? I think at some point we went down to like, oh, well, from 6 months to 4-week sprints to 2-week sprints. Some companies are doing 1-week sprints, right? Because they've forgotten about the fact that we're taking a bet, right? And a bet is really where we're talking about some feature or some problem that we're solving, and we're trying to solve that in an iterative way. And they just kind of broke work down into tasks devoid of its context, right?
Yeah.
And so now you can do it in these 2-week cycles, right? But you're completing a lot of work in 2 weeks, but rarely are you actually solving a problem. Like 2 weeks is, in most cases, unless you're fixing a bug or doing some very small features, just not enough time.
Welcome to Shapers and Builders, the show about better ways to deliver great software products. Today I'm speaking with Ilya Sterin, VP of Engineering at Medidata, a clinical trial company from the US with around 3,000 employees. This conversation is part of a series about companies that use ShapeUp, a delivery framework originally created at Basecamp. If you've never heard of ShapeUp, check the show notes for a link to the video Shaping in a Nutshell by Ryan Singer, former head of strategy at Basecamp and author of the book ShapeUp, Stop Running in Circles and Ship Work That Matters. In our conversation, Ilya explains his approach to introducing ShapeUp at scale. We go deep on the core conceptual pillars behind ShapeUp, like working iteratively, setting a big enough yet small enough batch size, and fixed time variable scope. Instead of a dogmatic, book-in-hand approach, Ilya chose to introduce ShapeUp to his teams by reasoning from the principles of software engineering and avoiding to put a label on this new way of working as much as possible. If you feel like ShapeUp might help your team improve but are afraid of being turned down, Ilya's experience might be just what you need to get started. So enjoy! Hey Ilya, I'm so glad to finally get to speak with you about your experience with ShapeUp.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'm glad to be here and talking a little bit about it. I mean, I talked to a lot of people about ShapeUp and sort of how I've been adopting it at various organizations and kind of extending my kind of learnings and thought process around it. But it's great to talk to you about it.
I see you very active in various LinkedIn and Twitter threads. Whenever someone is speaking about ShapeUp, I see your name pop up. Definitely appreciate you sharing.
Mostly around jobs to be done and ShapeUp and so on. I see a lot of, obviously I'm very passionate about it, but I also see a lot of folks that are also passionate about it, but I see a lot of misunderstanding about like what jobs to be done is, what ShapeUp is. And so I usually chime in mostly to like provide my opinion around it. So
yeah, that's it's going to take us a bit of the track I had planned, but what are the misconceptions that you maybe see with ShapeUp specifically?
Well, I think it's ShapeUp is less misconceptions because it's quite new. I think people are mostly I think as an industry we've gotten so deep into or you go to most companies, right, and they've adopted some sort of methodology like Agile, Scrum, or whatever it is, right, some modified version of Scrum. And I think that has become almost an end to itself. Like a lot of people will have a hard time telling you, like, why are there certain rituals to Scrum? Like why is there estimation, right? Whether I like estimation or not, like, why do we break work down into these bite-sized pieces, and why do we iterate, right? Like, and I think most people that I've run into, and especially in large organizations, have a heart. They've just gotten into this ritual of this is what we do, this is how we develop software, but we've forgotten these kind of first principles of like, well, why are we doing this versus something else, right?
Yeah.
Our world used to be quite, I mean, not even that long ago, right? I don't know, 2 decades ago, maybe even a decade ago, right? Quiet waterfall, right? And look, in some industries, waterfall development is the only way to go, right? Like it's not like the devil that everybody kind of makes it out to be, right? But we in software industry and some other industries have realized that we taking these big bets in an industry where redoing something is not expensive, right? Like doing agile development in vehicle manufacturing probably makes no sense, right? The risk of something failing and the cost of having to redo something is quite high, right? In our business, it's very low. The other thing is, and so we can benefit because it's so low. We can benefit from knowing, and this happens, by the way, in automotive, other manufacturing, in other industries as well, where people have an idea, right? They collect a bunch of research, they build a product, and it just doesn't take off as much as they thought it was going to take off, right?
Yeah.
In our world, we can actually mitigate a lot of that, right? By iterating, right? So as opposed to going in and saying, we know exactly what the end result is and what we want it to be, instead, we end up saying like, look, we have a hypothesis. What's the fastest way we can prove this and get a signal from the market that we're moving in the right direction? And then we, iterate over it, right? Like we make it a little better and a little better. And that's what iteration, that's another kind of a thing that I think people talk about agility, but they don't understand that agile is about iterating, and iterating is really about getting signals from the market. It's not like you can see a lot of companies doing agile, like Scrum and other methods, and they're like, yeah, we are agile, we're doing 2-week sprints, but they're not. They have like a 6-month plan and they're just doing 2-week increments, right? But they're never really going to like releasing it, gathering feedback, figuring out whether they're moving in the right direction and so on. So, iteration is one of those, kind of, I talk about some of these principles, right? It's like, do people really grasp what iterating is, right? Yeah. And so, we'll get into how I kind of approach, changing, processes within organizations now, right? Yeah. I started off as like, we're moving from Scrum to Shape Up, and that didn't go very well, right? Because again, it's like people don't see the immediate benefit because they don't understand what's not really working here, right? They've just kind of been a slave to this process.
Yeah. I think I mean, as much as I just love getting into it, I think we have to take just a quick step back and give a bit of context about your experience so far. I understand you've introduced ShapeUp in one company before, and now you're doing it again, right? Do you want to just run us very quickly through the arc of your career, what you've been doing so far, and what your role is now?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been at it for probably 23 years or something like that now. First job was, I think, in 2000. I started off as a software engineer. So the first half of my career was strictly software engineering. I got requirements from product and I built software, and I loved it, right? Like I loved solving challenging technical problems. It was about 2009 that me and a few other people started a company. So we started a company that started off, it was called Bazoo Sports, and then we kind of acquired and merged with a company called Chronotrack. So most people that are in that industry would know it as Chronotrack. In that process, I started off the first probably year and a half. Me and another co-founder were software engineers. We built the product. We had another co-founder had an idea. We built the product, and whether it's for the luck or because it was a great idea, it took off, right? we were expanding our customer base. We were growing pretty rapidly. And so, right, we got investment. And then we came to a point probably about 2 years into it. And again, as a software engineer in a company, you have the luxury of just like taking requirements and solving problems, right? But now I have more skin in the game, right? Not only do I care about solving technical problems, I actually want this to be financially rewarding for me, right? At the end when I'm building a company. And we came about 2 years into it. We came to sort of I don't want to call it a halt, but the growth stalled, right?
Yeah.
And we tried a bunch of things. We had great ideas. We had like super smart co-founders and so on. And, but every time we would do something, it was a fantastic idea in a conference room, right? And look, we were out there talking to customers and so on. But at the end of the day, we would go build something, and it wasn't really taking off as much as we thought, right? And we needed to grow our revenues, we needed to grow our customer base, and so on. And I got very lucky, probably a year before that I happened to run into a gentleman. This is actually a funny story. I was renting some office space, and there was a gentleman next to me that rented some office space, and I introduced myself, and he introduced himself, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm an inventor." It was a really funny story. And, we kind of just said our hellos, and introduced ourselves and went about our way. Right. And I didn't see him probably for, another year. This gentleman was Bob Mesta of the Jobs to be Done fame. Right. He was one of the inventors of the Jobs to be Done theory. And again, I had no idea what Jobs was. I had no idea who Bob was. I think he was also early in the process of kind of the Jobs was already developed and tried and tested in the industry, but he was early in the process of kind of taking it wide in the industry and spreading it. So we happened to be at a friend's house. We had some mutual friends. It was a New Year's party, I still remember. And I'm not the most social person. So we're at the party, people are talking about sports. I know nothing about sports. So I happen to just look around the room and try to find a corner I can go sit in. And there's this gentleman sitting in the corner. And I was like, wow, that's Bob. I think I remember him from a year ago. So I go sit down with Bob. We just start chatting, and I start telling him about, we were in the business, Groundtruck was in the business of timing and scoring marathons and triathlons. Right? Mm-hmm. And so we had the hardware and the software to basically outfit the runner with the RFID chips and then time and score them. We would provide other services around. And at the time, I think we were thinking about some other tracking mechanisms for athletes that aren't RFID related. And so I got to talk to Bob, and Bob is one of the most interesting individuals I know. And Bob says, "Oh, sensors, sure." So I'm working with the Harvard School on some sensor that they're developing, the Harvard Medical Center or something like that, and the sensor that they're developing for tracking my brain activity. And he literally, I think he pulls up his shirt. He has 3 sensors on his chest. He has a sensor on this, I think on his head, on this arm. And so we really get into we nerd out for the rest of the night. Mm-hmm. And now I know who Bob is. I really like him and so on. And we exchange numbers. He has an office now at a different place. And again, we go about our way. And a few months later, as we're running this business and I'm getting frustrated, somehow I get in touch with Bob. It's unclear to me whether I called him or whatever else. And Bob says, "Stop by my office." And that was a very life-changing experience for me. I kind of had the place in my brain to receive all that knowledge that he was giving, where before, probably a year ago, it would have just kind of went in one ear and went out the other, because I was struggling with trying to grow a business at the time. I was struggling with understanding customer demand. And this is when he introduced Jobs to be Done to me, and my world changed since. So ever since then, I became kind of, I talk about myself as kind of the intersection of product and engineering, right? Because I went pretty deep on jobs. We actually hired Bob to do Jobs to be Done for us. It was a very eye-opening experience for our business and so on. And I could not see what I've kind of seen and experienced, right? I could no longer look at engineering from just solving a kind of a technical problem, perspective. From now on, I looked at engineering as I'm actually trying to solve a customer problem. problem. And before I can do that, I need to understand the demand, and I need to understand the constraints and the context and so on, right? So either way, that was my first kind of foray into product, and ever since then, we sold the company in like 2013. I exited in 2015, and then went on to run a product organization at a kind of an automotive software company. So it wasn't a software company to begin with, but we came in and built a software organization to build products for automotive diagnostics. I did that for 5 years, and then came to Medidata 2 years ago. I had a couple of friends that worked here, and the problem seemed really interesting to me, especially at the time when the pandemic was happening and Medidata was helping a lot of these companies bring vaccines to market and so on. So I was kind of, energized by that. And also I wanted to take a stab at, I worked the first part of my career, my first job was at a big company. I worked at Ford Motor Company. Ever since then, I've been in the startup world, right? And I've always said, like, I'll never leave the startup world. Like, I love smaller companies. I love the impact that I can make and actually see at the same time and so on. But I got to a point where somewhere towards my end of my tenure at this automotive diagnostic software company, that I've kind of developed this system of product and engineering, right? I personally didn't develop it, but I've kind of combined it out of what I learned from Bob and from Ryan and from others and from my experience. And it worked fairly well. And I wanted to see how to kind of scale that at a larger organization. So I kind of took that challenge to say, first of all, I love the problems that Medidata was solving, but at the same time, it was a much, much bigger organization that I was used to working for, a decade and a half before that. And I just wanted to scale the system in a larger organization.
Yeah, I'd love to understand. First of all, I absolutely love the story of you getting to know Bob Mester. That has to be one of the most unique getting to know Bob stories that I've ever heard, for sure. And I'd love to understand a bit more the size of companies that you've worked in, because I understand that at the automotive diagnostics company, you introduced ShapeUp, right? In a way. And what size was that? And now what size is Medidata?
Yeah, it was about, I can't remember the exact number, but it was about 40 people, I think, at the time. And we kind of varied off and on. But it was a small company. It was 40 people. We had 3 product teams at the time, right?
Okay.
And we were doing some modified form of, like, our own custom form of Scrum. So it was a lot of, like, the Scrum, rigmarole. And we were doing fairly well. We had a small team. It was just small team of very, 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 very talented people. And so we probably would have done well with any methodology, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Right? But I wanted to do better, and I wanted to do better as far as in terms of we had a lot of output that we put out every sprint and so on. I wanted to align it more with the outcomes that we were trying to get to, right? And again, we were doing good, but I saw a path to do better. And this was also at the time when so I was very early on when Ryan, before he wrote the book, Ryan did a session at the 37 Signals or Basecamp's offices in Chicago, kind of the early session to kind of test the waters, right? To understand, like, is his, he basically did like a jobs to be done project before he wrote the book to understand the demand, like what people are struggling with, right? What questions they have and so on. So I was in that session, and everything he talked about was just so invigorating. Like, so it like just really, really resonated with me, right? Because it's all these things that I've struggled with over the years, right? This intersection between product and engineering, and how to do engineering better and focus more on outcomes and the trade-offs and so on. He just had fantastic language around, right? But language that I'm just not smart enough to develop myself, right? And so everything resonated, everything was coming, and everything could be linked back to almost like the first principles of like development, right? It wasn't just like, hey, this is the methodology we follow and it works great for us because Basecamp is successful. You guys should do it. Like, it kind of went back to, like, you can link it back to like, well, why are we doing any of these things, right? Like, why does it help improve the flow, right, within our organization? Why does it help us align better with the outcome? Why does it help us iterate better, right? And so it just really resonated with me. So we can get into how I kind of, first introduced them, but the company was about 40 people at the time, I think.
Let's get into that. How did you? That's a reaction I get from a lot of people is it sounded so right. Everything resonated, and I can definitely relate.
Yeah.
So you went to was it the Shape and Ship workshop or something? I remember seeing that on Twitter. I don't know what it was called.
Yeah, I don't remember the name now, but it was like this first introduction of. I know he was working on this with Bob. I mean, obviously Bob was involved at the time. I don't remember what it was. Probably Shape and Ship or something like that.
So you're kind of pumped from that experience. What did you do?
People over process. And I'm not going to come back. And even though like I had, I ran the organization, I could have came back and said, hey guys, starting tomorrow morning, we're using ShapeUp. Obviously, I'm not going to do that. I had some really awesome people in my organization. They were very smart. I trusted them a lot. So I wanted them. It's sort of almost like Bob never tried to push jobs to be done on me until I had the actual struggle. I didn't want to push this on folks until I can find them struggling at something and I can introduce that in that context, right? But the first thing I did was I actually, even though I oversaw the whole organization, I was very much hands-on with one of the products. Like I was almost a product manager there, right? And it was like 3 engineers at the time. And so I did, in that context, just kind of had a meeting, introduced ShapeUp and said, look, guys, and we were struggling, like, because I was intimately familiar with those struggles. I said, look, here are some of the things that we're struggling with. We tend to, finish a lot of user stories at the end of the cycle. Eventually, those equate to some sort of a feature that we release and so on. I think we can, the product is doing good, but I think we can do so much better. And here's why. And I started introducing those. And I also had really like experienced engineers on that team. So they were able to, again, kind of relate to what I was talking about. And so I introduced these concepts and I said, look, let's try to do this over the next cycle or two. We're going to increase our cycles. At the time, we went from 2 to 4 weeks. I wasn't willing to go 6 weeks just yet. I wanted to have like a smaller time frame. If we're doing something wrong, I didn't want to wait all the way for 6 weeks, right? So we did 4 weeks and it works fairly well. We actually do 4 weeks now and it works well for us, right? And so they were very receptive. We tried it and it worked really well from a perspective of like, we were able to plan our work better. Shaping helped us really clarify like the boundaries of the problems. So now Brian kind of calls it framing and shaping. So we first frame the problem and put boundaries around like what problem do we want to solve, this much, that much, or whatever. It's like guardrails around the problem. And then we shape it, meaning we go into the process of figuring out how are we going to solve it, right? We're not going too detailed. Sometimes we go detailed depending on, the unknown, like what unknowns we're trying to answer. But it's guardrails around the solution, right? And that helped me. I think I was also solving a personal problem where I was always kind of in the middle of the team making trade-off decisions because I feel like we didn't articulate that well, right? Like we had a user story and it had like some acceptance criteria in it. And then I would chime in 3 days into the cycle and see that maybe the team is not thinking about this the way I was thinking about it, right? Like it wasn't articulated in a way that ShapeUp kind of teaches you to articulate these problems as, again, boundaries kind of. And so I was solving my own problem. I was like, I want to be able to articulate what problems we're solving and maybe put some boundaries in the solution. I don't want to be involved in the day-to-day, right? I have other teams to run. I have an organization to run. And it worked really well. And so we started doing that. And we, again, we had some struggles. We can talk about those week 1, week 2. It was cycle 1, cycle 2, and so on. But it got better, progressively better over time. And then I don't remember the exact details, but obviously I had one-on-ones with my other, product managers from other teams, and they were time and time and again, obviously you talk about the problems that you're facing. And
Yeah.
I would, over a period of probably of a couple of months, just every time a problem came up, right? The team didn't make the right trade-off, right? Or something like that. Or again, we're 2 weeks late on producing something and so on. I started introducing these concepts like appetite, the trade-off that you're making, the sort of the guardrails that you're setting and shaping and so on. So I started introducing this. Eventually, they were able to kind of get their head around it in the context of what they were experiencing. And they were willing to say, I think it actually like happened within like a week period where we just decided, me and the other two product, managers that oversaw the other products, we were like, this makes total sense to us now. Let's go do it. Right. And that's when it happened overnight. Like they ran those teams and they introduced it to their teams. And the following, after the sprint was over, we started the new cycle and, doing Shape Up.
Yeah. Got it. But I mean, given your role as lead, what was the exact title there? VP Product Engineering, right?
Yes.
You did carry a lot of pull, regardless of the convincing.
I have trusted people that I work with. Fortunately, I've been very fortunate to work with people that are really good and I trust a lot. So I would never approach it as like, yes, I could have, again, in my position said, this is what we're doing. I want people to really, everything works better when people can put anything within the context of something they're struggling with. Right.
Yes.
Just like when I learned jobs is within the context of trying to grow a company. If I would have just went to a jobs workshop and things were just going well, I don't think I would have received it in the same way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I also, if you, what I always do in these episodes is I link this Shaping in a Nutshell video that Ryan has for context. And I think in there, he also makes a great point of starting from, if you observe these three problems, Shape Up might be for you. And it seems like you've taken kind of a similar route of introducing Shape Up by showing the struggles or highlighting the struggles and how Shape Up fits.
Like one of the things that we were doing sprint reviews all the time, or cycle reviews, right? And in a lot of companies, you would see a sprint review is just, we finished these stories, right? And let me demo you this story. But what I'm really looking for is like, what problem did we solve? Like, I want the larger outcome being demonstrated there, right? And so that was one of the sort of the issues that we had I feel like at Tweddle was the name of the company, was that, we can go into every sprint. The team was moving fast. They were producing a lot of work. But it was hard to really align it with like, look, we took this chunky problem, right? We scoped it well enough, right, that we can fit it within our appetite. We finished the work, right? And now we can actually demonstrate it in the context of like, we solved a problem in this particular way, right? And so it just made everything so much like a lot. Like, you always talk about outcomes and product, and then so my really good friend Chris Speak, you probably know Chris as well. Always, I don't remember if him or Ryan that said that first, but they always talk about like, you take this description of a problem and the design and how you think about it, and then you put it through this Scrum paper shredder, right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, break it into stories, and everybody's working on these stories, and eventually it comes together. And that's what we were trying to solve, because like I wanted the team to just go out and solve this particular problem constrained within the appetite. And so yeah.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times how Shape Up is designed in a way from first principles, or how at least those come through in how it's communicated. How have you, and you've mentioned this to me before when we were speaking about your experience now at Medidata, how did you use that to then scale Shape Up at a company where you did, I don't want to lean too heavily, and you've made the point that this wasn't any part of you introducing Shape Up, but where you're not the head of the food chain, but you're coming in and having to convince an organization, or not convince, but improve?
Yeah. So I was head of sub-organization. I wasn't obviously head of all of metadata product development, right? But my approach was very similar, right? It was within my organization. I think it works better like that if it grows kind of organically, right? I had a few teams that I just joined that we were building. And some of these teams struggled, meaning I took over some teams. Sorry, we didn't build a new team. And some of these teams struggled for a while, all right, producing the right outcomes and producing on time and so on. And so I took one team. Again, fortunately, I had a really fantastic product manager, Ian. He still runs those teams right now. He really he grasped this because, again, I think he was struggling with being able to, have his team be as productive as it could be with Shape Up or some of these principles that we'll talk about in a minute. I introduced it to him, and we were in a place where, look, it wasn't that the team was already in this fantastic state of flow and I didn't want to disrupt it. Like, the team was in a place where we wanted to change something, right? And so we started with a small team. Again, it was a few people. It was easy to introduce these concepts. We actually, I wanted to pull the team out of like the standard SDLC I mean, we still have to follow it for regulatory reasons, and we do. But I also wanted the team to kind of do work in another tool. So we actually started using Basecamp. I still think Basecamp is a really good tool for implementing. Obviously, they build that tool for themselves. And it's just a really good tool for, actually, it's not great for like shaping and planning and like brainstorming and so on, but it's a great tool for actually executing the project.
Yeah.
And so we went to Basecamp and again, we started shaping, and there were growing pains. Again, like usually, you start shaping and, what does that mean? Is it just narrative format? Like, every team is different. Some teams require more details in the shaping process. Some more mature teams that are very familiar with the domain require less, right? So it's a lot of art, right? This isn't like a specification that you get in a lot of other, processes where it's like, here's how you write your acceptance criteria. You do this for every single story. It's really art. You have to know your team, and you have to kind of, shape the work in the way that will resonate. Like, they will know what trade-offs they can make, what problems they're solving, and what decisions and how to kind of solve that problem, how to think about that problem, right? But it's very dependent on the domain, on the team, on how long the team's been together, how mature they are, right? And it changes over time, right? You can start off being kind of over specifying things and then get kind of a little bit more abstract as the team more matures.
Do you remember the first exchange that you had with this product manager about Shape Up?
I think, not really, because we had so many exchanges, but I think one of the first exchanges, typically what I do, I've introduced Shape Up so many times that it's always like you just feel repetitive, and it just gets tiring, right? Because it's like it's almost like I'm not great at, like, I love teachers and I have a lot of respect for teachers. And I think one of the issues I would have teaching is like, you do the same thing kind of every new people, right? But it's the same material. So I've always like wanted something to like before, like I love talking about like the details and debating some of the principles and so on. But there's some basics, right? There's like some kind of baseline ground level things that people need to know first. I always wish there was like good material around it. And so I usually would point them towards Ryan's book, right? It was a great book. I wish there was something like more concise just to introduce them to some of these concepts without having to read the whole book. But that book is an easy read. So typically when I start off, I give them like a 5-10 minute kind of like, hey, look, there's another way to think about software. If you're late on projects like this, like you inverse, like you talk about appetite versus like estimates and so on. So I give them a little bit of like a preamble of like why they should read the book and say, look, go read the book and let's talk about it in a couple of days. Right. But now Ryan really the video, right? So at times I would just send people that video, and I think it was a more concise way to introduce people of like why somebody would even want to spend time on this, right?
Yeah. Okay, got it. I mean, I agree. But the video now is a good resource. It's like 20 minutes, so it's easy enough to send somebody.
Yeah.
Let's pick apart the kind of the principles of Shape Up. What are they to you, and why are they so powerful?
Yeah. So there are a few, right? We like one of the ones that I always like to talk about when people say like, "Are we going to do 4-week cycles or 6? Why not 2?" And like, agile is smaller cycles. And I said, to me, well, why? Why are cycle times small? And so we start talking about this whole concept of the bets that you're taking, right? So it used to be in the waterfall world, you would take a huge bet. It was a 6-month, a 1-year risk, right? And we talked about it a little earlier, right? Where, in the software world, right? Redoing something is somewhat cheap, much cheaper than the manufacturing world. And so you want to take smaller bets, right? And so, and that was what Agile was about. You take smaller bets and you iterate over these bets. But I think in a lot of industry, just because something is good, more of it doesn't mean it's constantly getting linearly better, right? I think at some point we went down to like, oh, well, from 6 months to 4-week sprints to 2-week sprints. Some companies are doing 1-week sprints, right? Is they've forgotten about the fact that we're taking a bet, right? And a bet is really we're talking about some feature or some problem that we're solving, and we're trying to solve that in an iterative way. And they just kind of broke work down into tasks devoid of its context, right?
Yeah.
And so now you can do it in these 2-week cycles, right? But you're completing a lot of work in 2 weeks, but rarely are you actually solving a problem. Like 2 weeks is, in most cases, unless you're fixing a bug or doing some very small features, just not enough time, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can complete a bunch of stories within an epic, and then you complete some more stories in another sprint. And eventually you feel, the epic is complete, right? And there are problems with that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what I talk about is, look, really about when we talk about cycle times, we're talking about batch sizes. It's really about like appetite. It's about us saying we're willing to work in 4-week kind of bets, right? Like we're willing we have a 4-week appetite to take a risk on something that, even though we have a hunch and we might have a lot of data around it, we just don't really know until the market tells us, right? And so that's when we start. I mean, to me, that's if you understand the principles of iteration and batch sizes and so on, then we can talk about it's no longer just like, well, why 2 weeks? Because people feel like when you go from 2 to 4 weeks, you're just going to be working slower, but it's not. Right?
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to see progress every 2 weeks, right? So that's one of the principles, like batch sizes, right? Like let's actually talk about the ideas of why batch sizes, why big bets are bad, in our world, why smaller bets are better, and so on. And we get into like appetite over estimates, right? That to me is always, that's an easy thing to resonate with people. It's a hard thing to adopt, but it resonates with everybody, because if you look at almost every project that does estimates, they are almost always perpetually late. They're all right. When I got to this company, this was actually very eye-opening to me. They were doing estimates, and they were like saying we can do 50 story points in the cycle, and 30 would get finished, and just automatically the other 20 would just roll over to the next.
Yeah.
And it was just perpetually just roll over. People just stopped paying attention to it, because at the end of the cycle, you can just say, look, we did 30 points. Great. Fantastic. Let's clap, But what did we actually achieve? And so when we talk about appetite, one way, for me, appetite is really about us. It's a two-way thing. One is the business saying, look, guys, we have all these other problems to solve. We are prioritizing this one, but it's only worth it to us to solve it right now if we can do it within 4 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever. Mm-hmm. You can do small batch projects and so on, right? So one is that business angle, and the other one is during the implementation, it forces trade-offs. To me, the best creativity comes from introducing constraints, whether constraints exist naturally or you introduce artificial constraints. It makes people get more creative. And it's a constraint that forces trade-offs. You no longer can say, I'm going to build some best version of something, which I don't even know what that means. There's a million best versions of those things. You actually immediately start constrain your optionality space, right? And so that's that. So when we talk about appetite and estimates, it's not just like, oh, I hate estimates. Like, let's just do appetite because from a business perspective, I want you to work all night long to meet that commitment. That isn't what that's about. It's really about forcing trade-offs. Right?
You mentioned that sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, but you mentioned the difficulty between theory and practice on appetites. I'd love to hear kind of your war stories, how you've maybe burnt your hands on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the hardest part about working within those constraints, people are not used to in most organizations. They haven't trained their trade-off muscle at that. Like on a lot of engineering teams, engineers don't actually have a lot of latitude to make decisions, right? They get the latitude to figure out like, what library am I going to use or whatever else, but they don't actually get scope latitude, right? And so you have to start making actually larger solution trade-offs. And they haven't, like, a lot of people just haven't built, they're more than capable. They just haven't built that muscle, right? So, mostly when we start working with appetite, even when the idea has resonated, things still, like in the beginning few cycles, might, like, you actually have to handhold on making decisions up front. You have to teach people how to like scope work. That's another thing that we'll talk about. That's another, like, why do we scope work? Is it just so like we can break work down and I can track it? No, it has nothing to do with it, right? And so we are I'm trying to figure out like how to best introduce this. So typically what ends up happening is if somebody fails an appetite, it's because they are not answering the hardest questions first, right? They're not making enough trade-offs and enough decisions up front in the cycle, right? And it's easy to say that, right? But you have to actually build the muscle to do that. And you have to have some tools, some thinking tools in place to help you do that. And that's when we get into this next thing, is about scoping and tasking, right? Why do we scope, right? Again, it's not just breaking work down because project managers want to see how many tasks do we have so we can figure out the percentage that we're complete. It has nothing. Scoping is really about thinking and dissecting the problem into slices, right? And so we're dissecting problems into these as orthogonal as you can get slices, right? So you're trying to reduce interdependence. One is maybe two people can work on that in parallel, but two is also so you can complete each one of them in isolation. Then you look at the scopes, and then you can do some like interdependent stuff on them, right? To say like which one is dependent on what other one, right? Then you can look at them from an angle of like which one is the riskiest one, right? And this is how you start prioritizing these scopes. And this is really how you're kind of just like mapping out your like directions to your destination. That's what scoping is about. This is like I don't know if you've ever listened to like Rich Hickey, hammock-driven development talks and so on. It's like, it's almost like we don't think enough about the problem before we just jump in and start kind of solving it, right? This is a way to like dissect the problem, look at it from different dimensions. It doesn't take long, right? Like when people think about it, it's like, well, I just want to start coding, right? But it's like, no, you have a 4-week cycle. I'm asking you to take 2 weeks to dissect the problem and understand how you're going to approach it. And you're going to discover like unknowns in that process. You're going to discover interdependencies. You're going to discover, where the risks lie. That will actually help you do a better job. So again, when we go into scoping, it's not like process for the sake of process, right? It's not about tracking, right? It's about like, it's a thinking tool to me. Right. A lot of times you can scope in Basecamp, but we actually go scope on a whiteboard. Right. And it's like we create a bunch of tasks and then we do affinitization. Like Ryan taught me this fantastic method of called affinitization, right? Which is you kind of start how do you start thinking about scopes? Well, you list all these things that you think you might want to do, and then you start kind of clustering them together without any labels at first, see how they fit, and those become your scope. So there's some tools to do that. You don't always have to reach for those tools, right? But again, it's a thinking tool. It's a problem-solving tool. It's not just a process tool.
Yeah, and I think he even did a Mind the Product talk on that. This scoping and kind of the brain dump and then dissecting it. I can link that.
Two of the tools he kind of taught me is the affinitization and interdependencies. And I think it's between like Ryan and I think Bob has used those tools for years in other contexts and so on, right? But affinitization is around creating groups of things that you can't foresee right away, right? And just kind of creating those scopes, those orthogonality or orthogonal scopes, right? And then interdependence is about figuring out it's really about trying to figure out sequencing, right? By figuring out what's dependent on, if I do this thing first, will it help me do this other thing better, right?
Yeah.
And those tools, I reach for those tools all the time, especially in the more complex projects.
Yeah. You've mentioned the change in nature of the work for an engineer working within ShapeUp, and that all of a sudden now they have this freedom, responsibility, pressure. You can frame it either way of making trade-offs. And a lot of people that I've talked to have relate to me that there's a spectrum of engineers they work with, where some people do just prefer clear specifications and having a mission to execute on those. How has your experience been with kind of really changing the role of an engineer at its core?
Yeah. It's mostly been good. I mean, look, let's be honest. There are more engineers with more, I don't even call it more experience, right? With that feel more comfortable with optionality and making decisions, right? Somehow they've developed that muscle, whether they were at some smaller company where they had to wear multiple hats and whatever else. And those typically, the transition for those is almost immediate, right? Because they've almost always been earning for to have that responsibility to solve problems in that way. Those are the people that I usually actually approach first to win their hearts, because I know, right, they would love working in that way, right? They kind of almost implicitly do work in that way, even though they still go in and, follow that process because it needs to happen, right? And then there's a spectrum of there's engineers that they never work like that, right? But they have the ability to. I think everybody has the ability to work that way, but then there's some that are open to it, and it takes a few cycles, right, and some hand holding, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it takes a couple cycles, some hand holding, and it resonates with them, and they become really good at it, right? And it helps them grow as an engineer, right? Not just in years of experience, but actually in solving problems, right, in novel ways. And then there are people, I mean, I've had the experience, which for some reason it just doesn't resonate, and those people just don't fit into that culture anymore, right? And sometimes, we have to part ways. It happens rarely, right? And I wouldn't even say it's the people, right? It might be me, right? That I didn't take enough time to, whatever happens in that process. There are some people that they just don't get it, or it doesn't resonate, or I'm doing a bad job explaining it and so on. It just doesn't resonate, right? But by that time we're working in that way. So we, if we're hiring new people, we also hire them to make sure that they can work within that kind of, new method and in this kind of culture that we've created around problem solving, right? But so again, to your point, it happens where some people, it just doesn't resonate with them for whatever reason, and they do prefer to just, I just want a set of acceptance criteria and leave me alone. I'll put it. But by that time, that isn't the way we work, right? And it's just a bad fit.
Yeah. Hey, I hope you're enjoying the conversation. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening and to let you know about the Shapers and Builders job board. On shapers.builders, yes, that's the domain, you'll find jobs in software development, design, product management, and other roles at companies that work with ShapeUp. Many of these roles are remote, and teams who use ShapeUp generally run at a more sustainable, healthy, and meaningful pace than the hamster wheel of 2-week sprints. So if you're looking for a job in tech or trying to find great people, head over to the Shapers and Builders job board at shapers.builders. Now let's turn back to the conversation. What were some of the headwinds, the concerns that you had to navigate when introducing ShapeUp? What were the biggest points of opposition?
Yeah, I mean, more so probably now at a larger company, right?
Yeah.
And some of it is political, right? There's somebody in the organization that has done a great job putting together tools, resources, and SDLC around the current process, right? And there's this natural pushback of like, no, like what? This is why I don't always approach it like, yeah, we're just going to stop doing Scrum, we're going to stop doing ShapeUp, as opposed to like, we're just going to gradually start introducing some of these concepts into the process, right? So and even though we do this gradually, eventually, you know, people hear about it and they start, you know, and people hear about like, this team is doing something different, like, you know, and is it a threat to this process that we have? And it's never a threat because it's not about my process versus your process. It's about us working better. It's about us bringing more value to the customer faster, you know, and bringing more value to the customer as well as bringing more value to the organization that can produce that value for the customer because we can iterate faster and you know, and so on. So it's really about that. But there's politics, right? And so and at times people get scared off by change, right? This thing has been in place for 10 years. It works. Why are we changing tools? That requires a lot of approvals. That requires, you know, a lot of changes to the process. So typically in those scenarios, there are groups that are disconnected from, and it's not their fault. It's just the organizational setup. They're disconnected from producing outcomes, right? So if you think about it, in a lot of organizations, people responsible for the process, they are responsible for, they've gotten into a state of flow for producing a lot of output, right? And that's what they're measured on, right? Like a lot of companies, you know, on their whatever weekly, bi-weekly calls, they go over, you know, the velocity of teams. Like that's a measurement of, I don't know what value. It definitely isn't, right? But they've got they have a system in place and it produces a lot of that output. But when you're aligned around outcomes, and those outcomes are business outcomes, like we actually need to, like we're a for-profit business, we need to create value for our customers so they pay for it. Then you start wanting to change the process to align that more with that. You're just more open to, like, if it's not working, right, you're more open to changing that process, right, whatever it takes to produce those outcomes, because you know, those people are graded based on those outcomes, right? There's incentive to producing those outcomes. But there are, in a large company, you create think about these siloed organizations that are so far away from the actual business outcomes. I mean, this isn't even about this part. Like, think about one of my favorite examples is like, think about I don't know, security organization, right? Cybersecurity within a company, right? If you don't align that organization with business outcomes, right, what you end up doing is they are always kind of like the gatekeeper of everything, and they have very little incentive of changing that process. The only incentive is to keep adding things to make it harder and harder to release software, right? Because they get their ass kicked when a cybersecurity incident happens, but they get very little incentive or reward if the company has just, you know, built another feature or product and its, you know, revenue by 20%, right?
Yeah.
So they typically build. So that happens in a lot, like the larger the organization gets, somebody's responsible for the process, and that process becomes like an end in itself to producing output, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes the hardest thing, because then somebody on the product side is trying to change the process because they want to align it with outcomes, and there's just politics in play.
Yeah. And you mentioned that one way around that, if I understood you correctly, is kind of masking it as the same thing but different until you can't anymore. Did I kind of catch that right?
I mean, the best way to change this is to actually restructure the organization, right? Align everybody around the same goals, which is business outcomes, right? And if you do that, that will naturally make people more open to improving the process. Again, this isn't about process A versus process B. This is just about better iterative product development, right?
Yeah.
Everybody. So that's but obviously, we're not going to change our organizational structure overnight. So the best way I found is, you're absolutely right. We just make our teams better by introducing these principles, right? So some teams are running completely on ShapeUp. Some teams might still be doing parts of Scrum, but they've introduced this idea of scoping and tasking, right? Or this idea of shaping something and using some of the concepts from like framing and shaping to just improve what the teams are getting, so they can make these trade-offs, even though still they might be breaking it into stories and estimating them and so on. It's not ideal, but it's better than it was before.
Yeah. One of the critiques though that ShapeUp gets is because the cycle length, the batch size is bigger. And Ryan sent me this podcast that Kent Beck was doing, where he was voicing concerns of the software industry moving back towards a waterfall kind of mindset. What's your response in that case? Like, is ShapeUp mini waterfalls? Is it back to that, or?
I don't think so. Not even close. I mean, it's back to these, principles that we talked about before, like, the bets that you kind of want to take, right? Like, to say that moving from a 2-week cycle to a 4 or 6 week cycle is going back to waterfall. I mean, maybe Kent was talking about something else and not necessarily ShapeUp, and he might be seeing some patterns, but I don't think that's the case, right? You're increasing. So again, as I said, just because something small is good doesn't mean that you can infinitely make it smaller and smaller and smaller and it'll still be like linearly better every single time, right? Like, it's not, right? It's almost like a bell-shaped curve of like, there's like, on one side, you're talking about a 6-month bet. By the way, it might be good for some businesses. Depends on what the business is. Like in the hardware space, you might have to have longer cycles, right? Just because you can't do things in 1 week, right? So, but on one side, you have these huge bets, right? That's just too risky, right? And on the other side, you have put all the work through a paper shredder, and it no longer resembles the problem that you're trying to solve, right? And that's when you get into like the 1 or 2 week cycles. And look, some companies can do that. Again, it's very dependent on the domain, on the content. My point is to just think through that. Like, what size problems what size bets are we willing to take, right, to iterate on?
Yeah.
And so, but here's my problem. But you do that in the context of like making sure that the problem you're trying to solve, right? You're scoping it down, but the problem, like, and maybe you're biting off a slice of that problem, but it still stays together. So the problem with putting things through a paper shredder, right, is that somebody works on a story that's part of the larger, content, like larger problem that you're trying to, an epic, right?
Yeah.
And they are making decisions on how to solve this. The problem is they're not doing it in the context of all the other stories, right? So you might make a decision here, then and this happens, by the way, all the time, then you're working on another story in another sprint, right, to complete this epic, and you realize that you made a bad decision here. So now you have to go back and redo this, right? So it just creates more work. And creating bigger batch sizes, right? This, again, it's forget about the time for it. It's just about like, what's the appetite, right, to for us to invest in solving this problem to really just go to market and figure out if we're moving in the right direction, right? And keep that together, right? So the team needs to see that all within the context of the problem we're trying to solve. So when they're scoping, when they're making decisions, when they're seeing the whole forest and not just like, they're not just climbing one tree and then realizing there's like a million other trees and they're, different configuration, whatever. Like you're actually, you can see, you can zoom in on each task while you're doing it, but on a daily basis, you're still stepping out. You're still seeing the forest, right? And you're still making decisions in the context of that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference. You're totally right. Where also that then relates to carryover. You just keep going on the same problem. Whereas with ShapeUp, while you're looking at the full thing, you also make sure that you stop and when you've done the full thing.
Yeah. There is a lot of, in the Scrum world, one thing I'm seeing is there's a lot of rework happening. I mean, besides not meeting time commitments and estimates are always wrong. So there's just a lot of rework, right? Because again, one story, I mean, look, there are some companies that aren't solving big problems, right? They maybe it's a stable product and everything is just, a 2-day task, right? And in that context, by the way, Scrum works just fine, right? Actually, Ryan and I, he was visiting a few weeks ago and we talked about, these 3 different, and every team will have that, right? There's 3 different categories of kind of work on a team, right? One is we're solving a problem, right? It's a new thing. It's a new feature. It's like we're solving a juicy problem that we want to shape. We want to put an appetite on and so on. Then there is like the small batch work. These are all the little things, bug fixes, tweaking something to make it better, right? That doesn't require, like you can do that just fine using Scrum, right? We still do within the context of ShapeUp in terms of like we batch these things together into a cycle and so on. So you can do that kind of in whether it's Scrum or ShapeUp, it works just fine. And then there's this third category, which is urgent work, right? So there's like small, trivial, non-important work, right? Where you kind of batch together at some point in time. Hopefully, most of your time is spent solving nice problems, right?
Yeah.
Then you have the small work that you're doing. But then there's the urgent work, right? That is the work that like comes in. You have to at times drop things to do, right? At times, maybe you don't have to drop things today, but you have to do it pretty urgently within the next week or 2 or something like that. That work actually fits really well within the Scrum world, right? Like it's small work. I mean, small doesn't mean like maybe it's a bug that'll take you 3 weeks to fix. I don't know. But my point is like that, like the Scrum or the Kanban process is just fine for managing that work, right? So I'm actually experimenting right now with kind of these 2 methods, right? Where the small trivial work and the project work is done within the context of ShapeUp cycles, right? Mm-hmm. And then we still use like Jira or just the regular, I mean, Jira is just a tool, but we still kind of go back to like using Kanban or Scrum within the context of all the other things that come in that we just have to respond to. And I think the art here is, or the key here is really for capacity planning, right, on the team. Right? Mm-hmm. So you don't want, obviously, the team that's solving problems for us and trying to make progress on the product being pulled into these urgent tasks all the time, right? So we plan the small stuff, right? So those aren't interrupting the teams working on, the problem, the larger problems that we're trying to solve. But we also reserve some capacity, right, for the urgent, right? And again, depending on the team, the maturity of the product, how many bugs there are, how many urgent issues come up, it all depends. But it was just really eye-opening to break that work down, because in many cases when we were implementing ShapeUp, people would be like, well, how do we manage like the things that just come in we have to get done, right? Never really thought about it, right? Until like Ryan and I started talking about it. And but it makes sense. But what you don't want to do, right, is in the world that most people live in the Scrum world, is like urgent work is managed very similarly to the project work, right? Where it's just another ticket that you just say, hey, we're doing this. Here's a bunch of stories we're doing in the cycle. Urgent work comes in, you just drag it to the beginning. Like it's the same. I actually think separating those processes makes more sense, because then you have to think about capacity planning in a different way. And you actually have to then, and capacity planning, if you do it right, will create focus and that's what you want. You want people focused on solving problems and making progress and taking the product forward, right? And sure, you want to absolutely reserve capacity for the urgent things, but I think, again, separating the two explicitly makes you think about capacity planning.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. We are coming up a bit on time, and I could spend 2 more hours kind of getting your take and your experience on these things. But I do want to understand now that you have, I don't think we've put a number to this, but you have an unbelievably huge product and engineering org at Medidata, right? I think you mentioned previously to me it's like 1,000 engineers in total, roundabout.
Yeah. So Medidata in total, I don't remember, 2,500 people or something like that. And it's a pretty large organization. I don't think it's 1,000. I think our product team, if you look at all the product team, and that includes, QA, engineering, and so on, is probably that, right?
Got it.
Within our organization where I work, which is our data platform, called Data Fabric, but it's our data platform organization. It's about 150 people or something like that there, right? But it's at a completely, like, even if we say there's 500 or 600 engineers doing the work, it's at a completely different scale that I've ever worked, right? Like it brings its own challenges, right? Changing a process isn't just like, let's have an all hands and we'll start next week, right? It is much more challenging.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, is where do you stand? How far have you rolled out ShapeUp? Do you have any ambition to go beyond that, or just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so the company has, again, there's pockets of ShapeUp all through the company, right? I mean, within my group, every team is doing ShapeUp now, right? And as I recently took over a couple more teams, and those were immediately transitioned to ShapeUp, right? Because it works. Like, people actually see us producing outcomes, right? And people are paying attention because there are all these other struggles on these other teams, right? But again, when you get into like, okay, well, it seems to work here, right? We are struggling. I think like if you look at jobs, I'm going to mention jobs, like the forces of progress, right? Of like somebody making a switch. I think there's that inertia and anxiety is still so high because for political reasons, for, just the amount of work that would have to go into, like, if we were to change our whole company's SDLC, right? Like it's a lot. So there's still like these overpowering forces that I'm still trying to figure out how to do. Maybe at some point, the whole metadata, the SDLC, is going to be based on ShapeUp. It isn't yet, but there are these pockets. So one of the other things is one of my good friends, Charlie Blazer, just joined, and we kind of hired him to run another part of the organization that deals with like sensors and so on. So it's a separate organization, and he was one of the product directors that I worked with before that implemented that at Tweddle. And so he brought a lot of that knowledge there. And so he's now starting to kind of infiltrate that into that other organization. So some of those teams are starting to use some of these principles. So it's there are these pockets. Also, the other one is our design organization is using some of these. So there were two of the directors of design actually went to Ryan's workshop that he just recently had, right? And when they came back, they're starting to use, again, they are not, our design works a little differently, but they're starting to use, so it's not like they work on, like 4-week cycles within the team.
Yeah.
Like, I wish at some point maybe we can get into that mode, right? But they're starting to use some of those kind of principles that we talked about, right? Within like appetite for some of the projects that they might be working on in isolation of the team because they're designing something, right? They're definitely trying to shape more work, right? And talk about like trade-offs and so on. So there's, again, I wouldn't say like the whole company is on ShapeUp just yet, but there are those pockets, and they're getting larger. Right. It's not as if we're just like 2 teams are running ShapeUp. They've been doing it for 2 years, but it's like this rogue team, right? Like it's definitely expanding.
Have you developed any standardized material now when like a team is like, hey, we want to try ShapeUp? You're like, I'm going to send over our not agile coach, but our ShapeUp coach.
No, so there are more people that can now do the training internally, right? It used to be just like me, and I had to join every meeting and so on. I have some really good people that have done that for a while now that can do that. I think the key here, besides the initial introduction and go read the book and we'll do a session and I'll explain some of these principles and so on, is let's actually do the work. Like I want people to experience that within the context of doing the project. Yeah. And the worst thing you can do there is to just say, go read the book. Here's a project package, or it used to be called a pitch, right? And like, I'll check in on you in a week, and in 4 weeks, I'm expecting this to be done, right? Like that's just not fair. So typically there's a lot of hand-holding in the beginning, right? And hand-holding, because it's like, it's learning, right? Like it's almost like you have like this teacher taking you through that first 1 or 2 cycles. And so usually what we would do, I used to do that. Now there's more people that can do that. So we kick off the first cycle, right? And there's some cycle kickoff call that we go over the pitch, right? People look through it, they ask questions, right? But they're still not sure. They've never worked like this before. There's a lot of anxiety. The next thing we do is, as opposed to just sending them off and be like, go scope your tasks, read the book and how to do it, we actually do an interactive session. Right. We'll open Basecamp, or we'll open Miro. We'll do some of these affinitization, exercises. We'll try to scope that work. Right. And then, we'll put it in Basecamp, and then I'll go in on almost a daily basis in the beginning to make sure that they're tracking things on the hill chart properly. They're creating more tasks. Like initially the tasks are kind of imagined tasks, and then you're discovering more tasks. And this really blueprint of how you're solving this problem should be changing, especially in the first part of the cycle, almost constantly, right? Because you're now doing, like, you've imagined all these things that you need to do, you've planned it, but now the reality set in and you started, you thought you can use this library and you couldn't. So there should be more things. And so you just want to see progress, right?
Yeah.
And so this leads me to, like, just to say one other, like, big principle I always talk about is like this concept of tracking work using hill charts, right? And like, so we start talking about that, like how work actually, like the principle behind it is how work actually happens. It's a reflection of real work. Like estimates are not, but real work happens when you, again, you go in, you think you know something, you start discovering things, there are difficulties. So you're discovering things, you're figuring things out, right? And then you're actually just polishing things up, putting the final touches on it and finishing this, right? And so one of the important things we talk about is there's 2 reasons we track this work. One is for me and for other leaders on the team, so we know, right? We don't want to micromanage. We don't want to have meetings every day, but we want to have an ability to look into a project and get some grasp of whether it's still on the right track, right? And know when to step in, right? Hey, this doesn't look like, it looks like you're struggling here. Can I help, right?
Yeah.
And so one is for us, but even more importantly, I always teach this, it's for engineers. And they'll say like, why? Yeah, we don't need to try. Yeah, you do. Because if you scope and you task it, what you end up doing every day, if you get into this habit of like going in and putting things on the hill chart on a daily basis, looking at your scopes and so on, this is your way to get out of every engineer, every day you're in a rabbit hole, right? You start working on something, you're deep into it. You don't see the forest, right?
Yeah.
So this is your daily opportunity to step out and say, holy crap, I've spent all day on this. And that's like, this is not even important in the context of all these other things. It's a way to readjust, right? It's a way to it's just, again, a way to step out, zoom out for a minute and see, am I working on the most important thing? Am I working on the hard, am I asking and solving the right question, or and answering the right questions, right? So I teach that as a tool that they use. It's no longer, please do it because the manager is going to ask you the status on a daily basis.
Yeah. I
actually care less about that and more about them using it as a problem solving tool.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That resonates a lot. What Like if you're looking back now, it sounds like you've had great success in implementing ShapeUp twice. Is there anything you've done differently, or what are the learnings that you would, give to somebody who's interested in trying ShapeUp?
I mean, one of the, and I think this is what I just actually talked about. One of the number one learnings for me, especially in this larger organization, where there's a wider spectrum of skills and people and their experiences and so on, is this idea of kind of hand-holding in the first cycle or two. Look, it's not like you're going to like go read the book, shape a perfect project, and it's just going to go well in the first week.
Yeah.
That happened in my previous company because it was smaller. I had a tighter group of people that I was like more intimately involved with, so on. Like it was different, right? In a larger organization, again, there's a spectrum of skills, there's a spectrum of experiences, attitudes, and so on. Like you have to hand. It's gonna be hard, right? Because like you wish partly why you're doing this is so you can like give more latitude to the team, so you can step away and you can think about like. But that's not going to happen the first couple cycles. Like the team has to get into this state of flow. They have to learn all of these things in the context of doing them, and you have to guide them through doing them. Right? Yeah, that's probably. I wouldn't even say like. By the way, like I wouldn't say that's not true for anything else that you're doing. I mean, like that's probably besides, an industry and money. Like that's why in like the Scrum world, there's like Scrum coaches and so on, right? Because, you can teach the method in a classroom all you want, but eventually you have to learn it in the context of actually doing the work, and you have to get into like the state of flow, right? And so that's been big for me because I talked to my buddy, two of my friends, Chris and Justin at Autobooks, like a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about some of their struggles with that, right? And that's one of the big things that we kind of agreed on is that more hand-holding in that upfront process, more guiding them through these exercises of scoping, and I think the main thing is like scoping and tracking on the hill chart. Again, not tracking for the sake of tracking for the sake of that it helps you know when you need to make different trade-offs, right? Yeah. It makes you like look at the full spectrum of tasks and scopes and the time that you have left and the issues that you run in and almost pivot on a daily basis, right? Like, am I working? Am I thinking about this correctly? Am I working on this correctly? I think that's been my biggest learning in this organization because again, I was able to be more hands off in my previous role, right? It's like you had people that instantly understood it. They were engineers and product people, and they kind of ran on their own. It was less hand holding, where here it's quite a bit more.
So this is, I would kind of categorize this as a watch out to maybe people who are thinking about implementing ShapeUp and yearning for this, space for themselves, and then it's not happening. And the first few cycles, as you mentioned, might actually be more work than what you used to.
Yeah.
Where you're saying, what I hear a lot is we have all of these rituals. There's this huge overhead. We just kicked off something. Now I'm having to plan the next thing. And that's not going to happen immediately to get this freedom with ShapeUp.
Yeah. Unless you have somebody else that can help guide that. But in most cases, like when I came in here, I was the only one that kind of had, like knew ShapeUp well enough and those tools and so on. So I had to be more involved. Now I don't, right? Like I have great, fantastic folks and good, like senior engineering leads that know how to do that so they can step in.
Do you see something like an agile coach, a certification on the horizon for something like ShapeUp?
I don't know. I hope not. I hope that's like the beginning of the end of ShapeUp at that point. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like it totally makes sense to have somebody in an organization. It's almost like an enabler, right? As you're transitioning to this new way of doing, to come in and help. I wouldn't, I hope there's not an industry around it, right? I hope it's more of like a natural thing that a company does, right? That creates this enablement role that will go as you transition different teams to different ways of working. They can step in and work with that team for a few cycles to get them into that flow of things, right?
Yeah.
One other thing is that I learned is And I did that, learned some of it at Twaddle, but larger scale here is, again, don't try to come in and, like, don't think that the only way you can use ShapeUp and these principles is like if the whole company just switches to ShapeUp. Like, you have to go in and at the executive level convince everybody to rewrite everything about your process, right? I would argue that it's actually best to, even if you could do that, it's best to start off with 1 or 2 teams, get some wins under your belt, develop a process. There's probably going to be variations at every company, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the team, again, the domain and so on. There are going to be variations. Work out a good process and then kind of organically grow that, right? That's my, one of my learnings and one of my recommendations for people is not to just go in and basically it's, 0 or 100, right? Like shouldn't be the case.
And then I just kind of recap what you mentioned is then come in a principled way and not with this dogmatic book in hand.
Yes. Try to stay away from, because when you start talking about process switching, you run into politics, right? You run into it's partly politics. It's partly like just people thinking like, what does it take to change the process? Approach it more from like, again, like, let's go back to the basics. Like, we are here's the struggles that we're having and here's how we can solve them, and then take them back to like the everything can kind of go back to like, how do we iterate better over product, right? Over outcomes, right? We don't know what we don't know. The only way to do that is iterate. I think Ryan says this all the time. He's like, iterating is releasing, right? You would be amazed how many companies are like, think they're iterating and doing, they're doing 2-week sprints, but they're not really iterating, right? It's just, in 2 weeks, the code is tested and like, it's great. Now let's jump into the other, we'll release on a quarterly basis. Well, like, then why are you even doing 2-week sprints? Like, just do quarterly sprints, right? Like, what is the purpose of that? Like, the whole point of iteration, again, is testing this out in the marketplace, because you don't know if you did the right thing. You don't know if you need to augment it in some way or not. And the only way you're going to know is when you get that feedback from your customers. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're really coming up on time now. If you have a lot of experience on this, if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So I have a website, and then there's a link. I have a newsletter that I hopefully at one point it'll be more active than it is now. But you can just go to ilyasterin.com, and there's like a description of me there, as well as some of the links to my blog and my newsletter and so on. So and my contact information.
Great. I'll make sure to include that in the show notes. Any last words? Anything we missed?
No, this has been great, man. This is awesome. I mean, I hope we can, as I learn more about rolling this out in a larger organization, and I mean, I'm not the only one doing it. There's a slew of people all over the world trying to, implement and adapt ShapeUp. Like, I hope we can, maybe at one point have another call and I can share you some of the things and maybe contradict some of the things that I've said during this meeting.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Ilya. I certainly did. If you like this show, please leave us a favorable review on your podcast platform of choice. And to find jobs at companies that work with ShapeUp, like Medidata, remember to check out our job board at shapers.builders. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.